No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligences greater than man's. That as men busied themselves about their affairs, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. At most, terrestrial men fancied that there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. But certainly no one thought of Mars as a source of human danger. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. Nor was it generally understood that since Mars is older than our Earth, with scarcely a quarter of the superficial area, and remoter from the sun, it necessarily follows that it is not only more distant from life's beginning, but nearer its end. The secular cooling that must someday overtake our planet has already gone far indeed with our neighbor. Its physical condition is still largely a mystery, but we know now that even in its equatorial region, the midday temperature barely approaches that of our coldest winter. The atmosphere of Mars is much more attenuated than ours. Its oceans have shrunk until they cover but a third of its surface, and as its slow seasons change, huge snowcaps gather and melt about either pole, and periodically inundate its temperate zones. That last stage of exhaustion, which to us is still incredibly remote, has become a present-day problem for the inhabitants of Mars. And looking across space with instruments and intelligences such as we have scarcely dreamt of, they see at its nearest distance of only 35 million of miles, sunward of them, a morning star of hope, our own warmer planet, green with vegetation and blue with water, with a cloudy atmosphere eloquent of fertility. And we men, the creatures who inhabit this earth, must be to them at least as alien and lowly as are the monkeys and lemurs to us. The intellectual side of man already admits that life is an incessant struggle for existence, and it would seem that this too is the belief of the minds upon Mars. Their world is far gone into its cooling, and our world is still crowded with life, but crowded only with what they regard as inferior animals. To carry warfare sunward is indeed their only escape from the destruction that generation after generation creeps upon them. The Martians seem to have calculated their descent with amazing subtlety. Their mathematical learning is evidently far in excess of ours, and to have carried out their preparations with a well-nigh perfect unanimity. Had our instruments permitted it, we might have seen the gathering trouble far back in the 19th century. Men like Schiaparelli watched the red planet. It is odd, by the way, that for countless centuries Mars has been the star of war. But they failed to interpret the fluctuating appearances of the markings they mapped so well. All that time, the Martians must have been getting ready. It is almost 6 years now since the storm burst upon us. That year, as Mars approached opposition, Lavelle of Java set the wires of the astronomical exchange palpitating with the amazing intelligence of a huge outbreak of incandescent gas upon the planet. His spectroscope indicated a mass of flaming gas, chiefly hydrogen, moving with an enormous velocity towards the Earth. He compared it to a colossal puff of flame, suddenly and violently squirted out of the planet. He described it as similar in effect to the flaming gases rushing out of the mouth of a gun. A singularly appropriate phrase, it proved. Yet the next day there was nothing of this in the papers except a little note in the Daily Telegraph, and the world went in ignorance of one of the gravest dangers that ever threatened the human race. I might not have heard of the eruption at all had I not met Ogilvy, the well-known astronomer, at Ottershaw. He was immensely excited at the news and invited me up to take a turn with him that night in a scrutiny of the red planet. In spite of all that has happened since, I still remember that vigil very distinctly. I can still see the black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor in the corner, the little slit in the roof, an oblong profundity with the stardust streaked across it. Looking through the telescope, one saw a circle of deep blue with the little red planet swimming in the field. It seemed such a small thing, so bright and still, faintly marked with transverse stripes and slightly flattened from the perfect round. 40 million miles away it was, 40 million miles of void, and invisible to me because it was so remote and small, flying swiftly and steadily towards me across that incredible distance, drawing nearer every minute by so many thousands of miles, came the thing they were sending us, the thing that was to bring so much struggle and calamity and death. That night, too, there was another jetting out of gas from the distant planet. I saw it. A reddish flash at the edge, the slightest projection of the outline of the planet. And another invisible missile started on its way to Earth just a second or so under 24 hours after the first one. Hundreds of observers saw the flame that night and the night after, about midnight, and again the night after, and so for 10 nights, a flame each night. Even the daily papers woke up to the disturbances at last, and popular notes appeared here, there, and everywhere. It seems to me almost incredible now that with that swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. One night, I remember, I went for a walk with my wife. It was starlight, and I explained the signs of the zodiac to her and pointed out Mars, a brilliant dot of light creeping zenithward, towards which so many telescopes were pointed. It was a warm night. Coming home, a party of excursionists from Isleworth passed us singing and playing music. There were lights in the upper windows of the houses as the people went to bed. From the railway station in the distance came the sound of shunting trains, ringing and rumbling, softened almost into melody at the distance. It all seemed so safe and tranquil. And yet, all unsuspected, those missiles the Martians had fired at us drew earthward, rushing now at a pace of many miles a second through the empty gulf of space. The first falling star appeared very early one morning, rushing over Winchester eastward, a line of flame high in the atmosphere. Albin described it as leaving a greenish streak behind it that glowed for some seconds. Denning, our greatest authority on meteorites, stated that the height of its first appearance was about 90 or 100 miles. I was at home, working late, and writing in my study at the time, and although my French windows faced southeastwards and the blind was up, I saw nothing of it. Yet this strangest of all things that ever came to Earth from outer space must have fallen while I was sitting there, visible to me had I only looked up as it passed. Many people in Berkshire, Surrey, and Middlesex must have seen the fall of it, but no one seems to have troubled to look for it that night. Ogilvy had seen it, however, and he set out soon after dawn with the idea of finding it, and find it he did, not far from the sandpits on the common between Horsell, Ottershaw, and Woking. An enormous hole had been made by the impact of the projectile, and the sand and gravel had been flung violently in every direction over the heath and heather, forming heaps visible a mile and a half away. The heather was on fire eastward, and a thin blue smoke rose against the dawn. The thing itself lay almost entirely buried in sand amidst the scattered splinters of a fir tree it had shivered to fragments in its descent. The uncovered part had the appearance of a huge cylinder, caked over, its outline softened by a thick, scaly, dun-coloured incrustation. It had a diameter of about 30 yards. Ogilvy approached the mass, surprised at the size, and more so at the shape, since most meteorites are rounded more or less completely. It was, however, still so hot from its flight through the air as to forbid his near approach. A stirring noise within the cylinder he ascribed to the unequal cooling of its surface, for at that time it had not occurred to him that it might be hollow. He remained standing at the edge of the pit that the thing had made for itself, dimly perceiving even then some evidence of design in its arrival. The early morning was wonderfully still, and the sun, just clearing the pine trees towards Weybridge, was already warm. There was no breeze stirring, and the only sounds were the faint movements from within the cindery cylinder. Then suddenly he noticed with a start that some of the grey clinker, the ashy incrustation that covered the cylinder, was falling off the circular edge of the end. It was dropping in flakes and raining down upon the sand. A large piece suddenly came off and fell with a sharp noise that brought his heart into his mouth. For a minute he scarcely realized what this meant. He fancied even then that the cooling of the body might account for it, but what disturbed that idea was the fact that the ash was falling only from the end of the cylinder. And then he perceived that very slowly the circular top of the cylinder was rotating on its body. It was such a gradual movement that he discovered it only through noticing that a black mark that had been near him 5 minutes ago was now at the other side of the circumference. Even then he scarcely understood what this indicated until he heard a muffled grating sound and saw the black mark jerk forward an inch or so. Then it came upon him in a flash. The cylinder was hollow, artificial, with an end that screwed out, and something within the cylinder was unscrewing the top. He turned at once, scrambling away from the edge of the pit, and set off running wildly into Woking. He met a waggoner and tried to make him understand, but the tale he told and his appearance were so wild that the man simply drove on. He was equally unsuccessful with the potman who was just unlocking the doors of the public house by Horsell Bridge. But when he saw Henderson, the London journalist, in his garden, he called over the palings and at last made himself understood. "Henderson," he called, "you saw that shooting star last night?" "What about it?" said Henderson. "It's out on Horsell Common now." "Good Lord," cried Henderson, "a fallen meteorite, that's a good scoop." "But it's not a meteorite," said Ogilvy excitedly. "It's a cylinder, an artificial cylinder, and there's something inside." With an exclamation, Henderson dropped his spade, snatched up his jacket, and ran down to the railway station at once in order to telegraph the news to London. The newspaper articles had already prepared men's minds for the reception of the idea to some extent, and by 8 o'clock the word had got around, and a number of boys and unemployed men had already started for the Common to see the men from Mars. That was the form the story took, and I heard of it first from my newspaper boy about 9:15 when I went out to get my Daily Chronicle. I was naturally startled and lost no time in going out and across Ottershaw Bridge to the sandpits. When I arrived, I found a crowd of several hundred people surrounding the huge hole in which the cylinder lay. Everyone seemed greatly excited. There were a number of voices raised, and some sort of struggle appeared to be going on about the edge of the pit. As I drew nearer, I heard Ogilvy's voice shouting, "Keep back! Keep back!" A boy came running towards me. "It's a-moving!" he shouted as he passed. "I don't like it! I'm a-going home!" The crowd swayed a little, and I elbowed my way through. "He's fallen in the pit!" a voice shouted. I reached the edge of the pit, and Ogilvy saw me. "I say!" he shouted. "Help keep those idiots back! We don't know what's in this confounded thing!" A young man was standing on the cylinder itself and trying to scramble out of the hole. The pressure of the crowd had pushed him in. Nearly 2 feet of shining screw now projected from the end of the cylinder, and as I watched, the screw came out completely, and the lid of the cylinder fell upon the gravel with a ringing concussion. I think everyone expected to see a man emerge, possibly something a little unlike us terrestrial men, but in all essentials a man. I know I did. But what we did see was something resembling a little grey snake, about the thickness of a walking stick, which coiled up out of the blackness within the cavity and wriggled in the air towards us. It was followed by another and another, until 8 of these tentacles waved sinuously in the air before our eyes. A sudden chill came over me. There was a loud shriek from a woman behind, and astonishment gave place to horror on the faces of the people about me. Then a big, greyish, rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, rose slowly and painfully out of the cylinder. As it bulged up and caught the light, it glistened like wet leather. 2 large, dark-coloured eyes regarded us steadfastly. There was a mouth under the eyes, the brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the movements unspeakably terrible. Even at this first encounter I was overcome with disgust and dread. Suddenly the monster vanished. It had toppled over the brim of the cylinder and fallen into the pit, with a thud like the fall of a great mass of leather. I heard it give a peculiar thick cry, and forthwith a second creature appeared darkly in the deep shadow of the aperture. At that the crowd turned and rushed madly, blindly for the cover of the trees surrounding the common. I made for the nearest group of trees, perhaps 100 yards away, and there, among some young pines and furze bushes, I stopped, panting, and awaited further developments. And then, with a renewed horror, I saw a round, black object bobbing up and down on the edge of the pit. It was the head of the young man who had fallen in. He got his shoulder and knee up, and then he slipped back again until only his head was visible. Suddenly he vanished, and a faint shriek reached me through the afternoon air. The afternoon was fading to twilight before anything further happened. There had scarcely been an intimation of movement from the pit, and it was this, as much as anything, that gave people courage. As the dusk came on, a slow, intermittent movement upon the sandpits began, a movement that seemed to gather force as the stillness of the early evening about the cylinder remained unbroken. Vertical black figures in 2s and 3s would advance, stop, watch, and advance again, spreading out as they did so in a thin, irregular crescent. I, too, began to move towards the pit. And then, within 30 yards of the pit edge, advancing from the direction of Horsell, I noticed a little black knot of men, the foremost of whom was waving a white flag. I learned later that it had been decided that since the Martians were, in spite of their repulsive forms, evidently intelligent creatures, it might be advantageous to show them by approaching them with signals that we, too, were intelligent. Flutter, flutter, went the little flag, first to the right, then to the left. Closer and closer the little knot of men approached the edge of the pit. And then, suddenly, there was a flash of light, and a quantity of luminous greenish smoke came out of the pit in 3 distinct puffs, which drove up one after the other straight into the still air. This smoke, or flame perhaps would be the better word for it, was so bright that the deep blue sky overhead and the hazy stretches of brown common towards Chertsey, set with black pine trees, seemed to darken abruptly as these puffs arose, and to remain the darker after their dispersal. A faint hissing sound became audible, changing gradually into a humming, into a long, loud, droning noise. Then, very slowly, a humped shape rose out of the pit, and the ghost of a beam of light seemed to flicker out from it. Immediately, flashes of flame, a bright glare leaping from one to another, sprang from the scattered group of men at the edge of the pit. It was as if some invisible jet impinged upon them and flashed into white flame, as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. By the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling, and their supporters turning to run. I stood staring, not as yet realizing that this was death leaping from man to man in that little distant crowd. As the unseen shaft of heat passed over them, pine trees burst into fire, and every dry furze bush became a mass of flames. It was sweeping round swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. I perceived it coming towards me by the flashing bushes it touched, and I heard the crackle of fire in the sandpits and the sudden squeal of a horse that was as suddenly stilled. All along a curving line beyond the sandpits, the dark ground smoked and crashed. Something fell with a crash far away to the left, where the road from Woking Station opens out on the common. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the hissing and humming ceased, and the black dome-like object sank slowly out of sight into the pit. All this had happened with such swiftness that I had stood motionless, dumbfounded and dazzled by the flashes of light. Had that death swept through a full circle, it must inevitably have slain me in my surprise. But it passed and spared me, and left the night about me suddenly dark and unfamiliar, except where patches of bush and isolated trees smoked and glowed, and some houses towards Woking Station sent up spires of flame into the stillness of the evening air. With an effort I turned and began to run, stumbling through the heather. That night, nearly 40 people lay under the starlight about the pit, charred and distorted beyond recognition. And all night long the common from Horsell to Maybury was deserted and brightly ablaze. I remember very little of my headlong flight until I found myself near the bridge that crosses the canal by the gasworks. For a moment I could not clearly understand how I came to be there. My hat had gone and my collar had burst away from its stud. I walked unsteadily up the steep incline of the bridge, my mind a blank wonder, my muscles and nerves drained of their strength. I dare say I staggered drunkenly. Over the Maybury Arch a train, a billowing tumult of white firelit smoke and a long caterpillar of lighted windows went flying south with a clatter and was gone. A dim group of people talked in the gate of one of the houses in the pretty little row of gables that was called Oriental Terrace. It was all so real and so familiar, and that behind me, it was fantastic, unbelievable. Such things, I told myself, just could not be. I arrived home some 20 minutes later and startled my wife at the doorway, so haggard was my appearance. I went into the dining room, sat down, drank some wine, and so soon as I could collect myself sufficiently, told her the things I had seen. The dinner had already been served and remained neglected on the table while I told my story. "There is one thing," I said, to allay the fears I saw I'd aroused in her. "They are the most sluggish things I ever saw. They may keep the pit and kill people who come near them, but they cannot get out of it." I paused, remembering. Oh, but the horror of them. "Don't, dear," said my wife, putting her hand on mine. "Poor Ogilvy and Henderson," I said, "to think of them lying dead out there." When I saw how deadly white my wife's face was, I tried to reassure her again. I began to comfort her, and myself by repeating all I knew of the impossibility of the Martians establishing themselves on the Earth. In particular, I laid stress on the gravitational difficulty. On the surface of the Earth, the force of gravity is 3 times what it is on the surface of Mars. A Martian, therefore, would weigh 3 times more than on Mars, albeit his muscular strength would be the same. His own body would be a cope of lead to him. That, indeed, was the general opinion, and both the Times and the Daily Telegraph insisted on it the next morning. But both overlooked, just as I did, 2 obvious modifying influences. The atmosphere of the Earth contains far more oxygen than does that of Mars. The invigorating influences of this excess of oxygen upon the Martians indisputably did much to counterbalance the increased weight of their bodies. And in the second place, we all overlooked the fact that such mechanical intelligence as the Martians possessed was quite able to dispense with muscular exertion at a pinch. But I did not consider these points at the time, and so my reasoning was dead against the chances of the invaders. With wine and food, the confidence of my own table, and the necessity of reassuring my wife, I grew, by degrees, courageous and secure. "They've done a foolish thing," said I, fingering my wine-glass. "They're dangerous because no doubt they're mad with terror. Perhaps they expected to find no living things, certainly no intelligent living things. 1 artillery shell in the center of that pit will kill them all." I remember that dinner table with extraordinary vividness even now, my dear wife's sweet, anxious face peering at me from under the pink lampshade, the white cloth with its silver and glass table furniture. For in those days even philosophical writers had many little luxuries. The crimson-purple wine in my glass, all are photographically distinct. I did not know it, but that was the last civilized dinner I was to eat for very many strange and terrible days. So that was the state of things on Friday night. In the center, sticking into the skin of our old planet Earth like a poisoned dart, was the cylinder. But the poison was scarcely working yet. Around it was a patch of silent common smouldering in places, with a few dark, dimly seen objects lying in contorted attitudes, and here and there a burning bush or tree. Beyond, and at a safe distance, well away from the common itself, there was a fringe of excitement, a curious crowd of people coming and going, both on the Chobham and Horsell bridges. 1 or 2 adventurous souls, it was afterwards found, went into the darkness and crawled quite near the Martians. But they never returned, for now and again a light ray, like the beam of a warship's searchlight, swept the common, and the dreadful heat ray was ready to follow. And all night long the Martians were hammering and stirring, sleepless, indefatigable, at work upon the machines they were making ready, and ever and again a puff of greenish-white smoke whirled up to the starlit sky. About 11 o'clock, a company of soldiers came through Horsell and deployed along the edge of the common to form a cordon. Later, a second company marched through Chobham to deploy on the north side of the common. The colonel of the regiment came to the Chobham bridge and was busy questioning the crowd at midnight, and at about the same time a squadron of hussars, 2 Maxim guns, and about 400 men of the Cardigan regiment started from Aldershot. The military authorities were now certainly alive to the seriousness of the business. A few seconds after midnight, the crowd in the Chertsey Road at Woking saw a star fall from the heavens into the pine woods to the northwest. It fell with a greenish light, causing a flash like summer lightning. This was the second cylinder. Saturday lives in my memory as a day of suspense. It was a day of lassitude, too, with a rapidly fluctuating barometer. I had slept but little, and I rose early and went into my garden before breakfast. I stood listening, but towards the common there was nothing stirring but a lark. After breakfast, instead of working, I decided to walk down towards the common. Under the railway bridge I found a group of soldiers, sappers, I think, men in small round caps, dirty red jackets unbuttoned and showing their blue shirts, dark trousers and boots coming to the calf. They told me no one was allowed over the canal, and looking along the road towards the bridge I saw one of the Cardigan men standing sentinel there. I did not succeed in getting a glimpse of the common, for even Horsell and Chobham church towers were in the hands of the military authorities. The soldiers I addressed didn't know anything. The officers were mysterious as well as busy. I found people in the town quite secure again in the presence of the military. The soldiers had made the people on the outskirts of Horsell lock up and leave their houses. I must confess, the sight of all this armament, all this preparation, greatly excited me. My imagination became belligerent and defeated invaders in a dozen striking ways. Something of my schoolboy dreams of battle and heroism came back. It hardly seemed a fair fight to me at that time. The Martians seemed very helpless in that pit of theirs. About 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, there began the thud of a gun at measured intervals from Chertsey or Addlestone. I learnt that the smouldering pine wood into which the second cylinder had fallen was being shelled in the hope of destroying that object before it opened. It was not until about 5 o'clock, however, that a field gun reached Chobham for use against the first body of Martians. About 6 in the evening, as I sat at tea with my wife in the summer house, talking vigorously about the battle that was lowering upon us, I heard a muffled detonation from the common, and immediately after a gust of firing. Close on the heels of that came a violent, rattling crash quite close to us that shook the ground, and starting out upon the lawn, I saw the tops of the trees about the Oriental College burst into smoky red flame, and the tower of the little church beside it slide down into ruin. The pinnacle of the tower of the college had vanished, and the roofline of the college building itself looked as if a 100-ton gun had been at work upon it. One of our chimneys cracked as if a shot had hit it, flew up and came clattering down the tiles to land a heap of broken red fragments upon the flower bed by my study window. I and my wife stood amazed. Then I realized that the crest of Maybury Hill upon which our house stood must be within range of the Martian's heat ray, now that the college was cleared out of the way. At that I gripped my wife's arm and without ceremony ran her out into the road. Then I fetched out the servant. "We can't possibly stay here," I said, and as I spoke, the firing reopened for a moment on the common. "But where are we to go?" said my wife in terror. I thought for a moment and then remembered my cousins. "Leatherhead!" I shouted above the sudden noise. My wife looked away from me downhill. The people were coming out of their houses astonished. "How are we to get to Leatherhead?" my wife shouted. "Stop here," I said. "Keep under cover, down here by this hedge." And I started off at a run for the Crown and Anchor, for I knew the landlord there had a horse and dog cart. I ran, for I perceived that in a moment everyone on this side of the hill would be moving. Down the hill I saw a bevy of hussars ride under the railway bridge. 3 galloped past me, and in through the open gates of the Oriental College. 2 others dismounted and began running from house to house. The sun, shining through the smoke that drove up from the tops of the trees, seemed blood-red, and threw an unfamiliar, lurid light upon everything. I found the landlord in his bar, apparently quite unaware of what was going on behind his house. I explained hastily that I thought it wise to leave my house at once, and managed to secure the dog-cart and horse for a fee of £2 and a promise to return it without fail by midnight. At the time it did not seem to me nearly so urgent that the landlord should leave his house. I took care to have the cart there and then, and drove it off down the road. Leaving it in charge of my wife and servant, I rushed into my house and packed a few valuables in a tablecloth, then dragged the bundle out onto the road. The beech trees below the house were burning while I did this, and the palings up the road glowed red. 2 of the dismounted hussars came running up. They were going from house to house, warning people to leave. "What news?" I shouted. One of them turned and yelled, "They're out of the pit!" Then he bawled something about crawling about in a thing like a giant dish cover, and ran on to the gate of the house at the crest, followed by his companion. A sudden whirl of black smoke driving across the road hid them for a moment. Hastily bundling everything into the dog-cart, I jumped up into the driver's seat beside my wife. The servant was already seated in the cart, and in another moment we were clear of the smoke and noise, and spanking down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill towards Old Woking. At the bottom of the hill I turned my head to look back at the hillside I was leaving. Thick streamers of black smoke shot with threads of red fire were driving up into the still air, and throwing dark shadows upon the green treetops eastward. The smoke already extended far away to the east and west, to the Byfleet pine woods eastward, and to Woking in the west. The road was dotted with people running in the direction we were headed, and very faint now, but very distinct through the hot, quiet air, one heard the whir of a machine gun that was presently stilled, and an intermittent cracking of rifles. I am not an expert driver, and I had immediately to turn my attention to the horse. When I looked back again, the second hill had hidden the black smoke. I slashed the horse with the whip and gave him a loose rein until Woking lay between us and that quivering tumult. We got to Leatherhead without misadventure about 9 o'clock, and the horse had an hour's rest while I took my supper with my cousins and commended my wife to their care. My wife was curiously silent throughout the drive and seemed oppressed with forebodings of evil. I talked to her reassuringly, pointing out that the Martians must be tied to their pit by sheer heaviness, and at the utmost could but crawl a little out of it. But she answered only in monosyllables. Had it not been for my promise to the innkeeper to return his cart, she would, I think, have urged me to stay in Leatherhead that night. Would that I had. Her face, I remember, was very white when we parted. It was nearly 11 when I started to return. The night was unexpectedly dark. To me, walking out of the lighted passage of my cousin's house, it seemed indeed black, and it was as hot and close as the day. Overhead the clouds were driving fast, albeit not a breath stirred the shrubs about us. As I came through Woking, I saw along the western horizon a blood-red glow, which as I drew nearer crept slowly up the sky. The driving clouds of the gathering thunderstorm mingled there with masses of black and red smoke. From Ripley until I came through Purford, I was in the valley of the Wey, and the red glare was hidden from me. As I ascended the little hill beyond Purford Church, the glare came into view again, and the trees about me shivered with the first intimation of the storm that was upon us. Then I heard midnight pealing out from Purford Church behind me, and then came the silhouette of Maybury Hill with its treetops and roofs black and sharp against the red. Even as I beheld this, a lurid green light lit the road about me and showed the distant woods towards Addlestone. I felt a tug at the reins. I saw that the driving clouds had been pierced, as it were, by a thread of green fire, suddenly lighting their confusion and falling into the fields to my left. It was the third falling star. Close on its apparition and blindingly violent by contrast, the first lightning of the gathering storm danced out, and the thunder burst like a rocket overhead. The horse took the bit between his teeth and bolted. A moderate incline runs down towards the foot of Maybury Hill, and down this we clattered. Once the lightning had begun, it went on in as rapid a succession of flashes as I had ever seen. The flickering light was blinding and confusing, and a thin hail smote gustily at my face as I drove down the slope. At first I regarded little but the road before me, and then abruptly my attention was arrested by something that was moving rapidly down the opposite slope of Maybury Hill. At first I took it for the wet roof of a house, but one flash following another showed it to be in swift, rolling movement. It was an elusive vision, a moment of bewildering darkness, and then in a flash like daylight, the red masses of the orphanage near the crest of the hill, the green tops of the pine trees, and this problematical object came out clear and sharp and bright. And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career, a walking engine of glittering metal, with articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantly, as it seemed, with the next flash, 100 yards nearer. Then suddenly the trees in the pine wood ahead of me were parted, as brittle reeds are parted by a man thrusting through them, and a second huge tripod appeared, rushing, as it seemed, headlong towards me, and I was galloping hard to meet it. At the sight of the second monster, my nerve went altogether. Not stopping to look again, I wrenched the horse's head round to the right, and in another moment the dog-cart had heeled over upon the horse. The shaft smashed noisily, and I was flung sideways and fell heavily into a shallow pool of water. I crawled out almost immediately and crouched, my feet still in the water, under a clump of firs. The horse lay motionless, his neck broken, and by the lightning flashes I saw the black bulk of the overturned dog-cart and the silhouette of the wheel still spinning slowly. In another moment the colossal mechanism went striding by me and passed uphill towards Purford. Seen nearer, the thing was incredibly strange, for it was no mere insensate machine driving on its way. Machine it was, with a ringing metallic pace, and long, flexible, glittering tentacles, one of which gripped a young pine tree, swinging and rattling about its strange body. But it picked its road as it went striding along, and the brazen hood that surmounted it moved to and fro with the inevitable suggestion of a head looking about it. As it passed, it set up an exultant, deafening howl that drowned the thunder. In another minute it was with its companion, and 1/2 mile away, stooping over something in the field. I have no doubt that this thing in the field was the third of the 10 cylinders they'd fired at us from Mars. It was some time before my blank astonishment would let me struggle up the bank and push on towards my house. I walked among the trees trying to find the footpath up the hill. It was very dark indeed in the wood, for the lightning was now becoming infrequent, and the hail, which was pouring down in a torrent, fell in columns through the heavy foliage. Near the top of the hill I stumbled upon something soft, and by a flash of lightning saw between my feet a heap of black broadcloth and a pair of boots. Overcoming the repugnance natural to one who had never before touched a dead body, I turned him over to feel for his heart. His neck was broken, and he was quite dead. The lightning flashed a second time, and his face leapt upon me. It was the landlord of the Crown and Anchor. I stepped over him gingerly and pushed on up the hill. Reaching my house, I let myself in with my latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door, staggered to the foot of the staircase, and sat down, shivering violently. After a time, I discovered that I was cold and wet, and with little pools of water about me on the stair carpet. I got up almost mechanically, went into the dining room and drank some whiskey, and then I was moved to change my clothes. I made my way upstairs to my study. The window of my study looks over the trees and the railway towards Horsell Common. I crept towards the window, and as I did so, the view opened out until, on the one hand, it reached to the houses about Woking Station, and on the other, to the charred and blackened pine woods of Byfleet. There was a light down below the hill on the railway near the arch, and several of the houses along the Maybury Road and the streets near the station were glowing ruins. The light upon the railway puzzled me at first. There was a black heap and a vivid glare, and to the right of that a row of yellow oblongs. But then I perceived that this was a wrecked train, the foreparts smashed and on fire, the hinder carriages still upon the rails. Between these three main centres of light, the houses, the train, and the burning country towards Chobham, stretched irregular patches of dark country, broken here and there by intervals of dimly glowing and smoking ground. And this was the little world in which I'd been living securely for years, this fiery chaos. What had happened in the last few hours I still did not know. Nor did I know, though I was beginning to guess, the relation between these mechanical colossi and the sluggish lumps I'd seen disgorging from the cylinder. I stared at the three gigantic black things that were going to and fro in the glare about the sandpits. They seemed amazingly busy. I began to ask myself what they could be. Were they intelligent mechanisms, or did a Martian sit within each, ruling, directing, using, much as a man's brain sits and rules in his body? I began to compare the things to human machines, to ask myself for the first time in my life how an ironclad or a steam engine would seem to an intelligent lower animal. All through the long night I sat at my study window looking at the desolation below me. And then, as the dawn grew brighter, I got up and went quietly downstairs. I realized that the house was no place to stay in. My plan was to return at once to Leatherhead, and so greatly had the strength of the Martians impressed me that I determined to take my wife to Newhaven and go with her out of the country forthwith. For I'd already perceived clearly that the country about London must inevitably be the scene of a disastrous struggle before such creatures as these could be destroyed. Between me and Leatherhead, however, lay the third cylinder with its guarding giants. I determined, therefore, to go northward under cover of the woods and make a big detour by Weybridge and Epsom to reach Leatherhead. I filled a flask with whiskey and lined every available pocket with packets of biscuit and slices of meat. Then I crept out of the house and ran as quickly as I could down the road by which I'd come overnight. In the road lay a group of 3 charred bodies close together, struck dead by the heat ray. And here and there were things that people had dropped, a clock, a slipper, a silver spoon, and the like poor valuables. At the corner, turning up towards the post office, a little cart filled with boxes and furniture, and horseless, heeled over on a broken wheel. There did not seem to be a living soul on Maybury Hill. The majority of the inhabitants had escaped, I suppose, by way of the old Woking Road. There was not a breath of wind this morning, and everything was strangely still as I hurried along, cutting through the woods towards Byfleet. At Byfleet Station I emerged from the pine trees and found the country calm and peaceful under the morning sunlight. I was far beyond the range of the heat ray here, and had it not been for the silent desertion of some of the houses, the stirring movement of packing in some of the others, and the knot of soldiers standing on the bridge over the railway and staring down the line towards Woking, the day would have seemed very like any other Sunday. I reached Weybridge at about noon to find the whole place in such confusion as I'd never seen in any town before. Carts and carriages everywhere, the most astonishing miscellany of conveyances and horseflesh, the respectable inhabitants of the place, men in golf and boating costume, wives prettily dressed, were packing, riverside loafers energetically helping, children excited and for the most part delighted at this astonishing variation of their Sunday experience. In the midst of it all, the worthy vicar was very pluckily holding an early celebration, and his bell was jangling out above the excitement. As I crossed the railway bridge, I saw that a growing crowd of people had assembled in and about the station, and the swarming platform was piled with boxes and packages. The ordinary traffic had been stopped, I believe, in order to allow the passage of troops and guns to Chertsey, and I've heard since that a savage struggle occurred for places in the special trains that were put on at a later hour. I found myself at the place near Shepperton Lock, where the Wey and the Thames join. The Wey has a treble mouth, and at this point boats are to be hired, and there was a ferry across the river. Along the bank of the river, an excited and noisy crowd of fugitives had assembled. As yet the flight had not grown to a panic, but there were already far more people than all the boats going to and fro could enable to cross. People came panting along under heavy burdens. One husband and wife were even carrying a small outhouse door between them with some of their household goods piled on top of it. There was a lot of shouting and jostling, and every now and then people would glance nervously across the Wey at the meadows towards Chertsey, but everything over there was still. Across the Thames, except just where the boats landed, everything was quiet, in vivid contrast with the Surrey side. The people who landed there from the boats went tramping off down the lane. The big ferry boat had just made a journey across and was beginning to unload when a boatman near me shouted, "What's that?" "Shut up, you fool," said a man to a yelping dog. Then the sound came again, this time from the direction of Chertsey, a muffled thud, the unmistakable sound of a gun. Almost immediately, unseen batteries across the river to our right took up the chorus, firing heavily, one after the other. A woman screamed. Everyone stood arrested by the sudden stir of battle, near us and yet invisible to us. Then suddenly we saw a rush of smoke far away up the river, a puff of smoke that jerked up into the air and hung there, drifting. Forthwith the ground heaved underfoot and a heavy explosion shook the air, smashing 2 or 3 windows in the houses near and leaving us astonished. And then quickly, one after the other, 1, 2, 3, 4 of the armoured Martians appeared, far away over the trees, across the flat meadows that stretched towards Chertsey, and striding hurriedly towards the river. Little, cowled figures they seemed at first, going with a rolling motion, and as fast as flying birds. Then, advancing obliquely towards us, came a 5th. Their armoured bodies glittered in the sun as they swept swiftly forward upon the unseen guns, growing rapidly larger as they drew nearer. The one on the extreme left flourished a huge case high in the air, and the ghostly, terrible heat ray I'd already seen on Friday night smote towards Chertsey and struck the town. At sight of these strange, swift and terrible creatures, the crowd along by the water's edge seemed for a moment horror-struck. There was no screaming or shouting, but a silence. Then came a hoarse murmur and a movement of feet, a splashing from the water. A man, too frightened to drop the portmanteau he carried on his shoulder, swung round and sent me staggering with a blow from the corner of his burden. A woman thrust at me with her hand and rushed past me. I turned too with the rush of the people, but I was not too terrified for thought. That terrible heat ray was uppermost in my mind. "Get under the water!" I shouted, and I rushed right down the gravelly beach and hurled myself headlong into the water. The stones under my feet were muddy and slippery, and the river was so low that I ran perhaps 20 feet, scarcely waist deep. Then, as the nearest Martian towered scarcely a couple of 100 yards away, I flung myself forward under the surface. The splashes of the people in the boats leaping into the water sounded like thunderclaps in my ears. The Martian took no more notice for the moment of the people running this way and that than a man would of the confusion of ants in a nest against which his foot had kicked. When, Half suffocated, I raised my head above the water. The Martian's hood pointed at the batteries that were still firing across the river, and as it advanced, it swung loose what must have been the generator of the heat ray. In another moment it had reached the bank and was wading across. The knees of its foremost legs bent at the farther bank, and it raised itself to its full height again, close to the village of Shepperton. Forthwith, the 6 guns, which unknown to anyone on the right bank had been hidden behind the outskirts of that village, fired simultaneously. The sudden near concussion, the last close upon the first, made my heart jump. The monster was already raising the case generating the heat ray as the first shell burst 6 yards above the hood. Almost simultaneously, 2 other shells burst in the air near the body. The hood twisted round, but not in time to dodge the 4th shell, which burst clean in its face. The hood bulged, flashed, and was whirled off in a dozen tattered fragments of red flesh and glittering metal. "A hit! A hit!" I shouted with something between a scream and a cheer. I heard answering shouts from the people in the water about me. The decapitated colossus reeled like a drunken giant, but recovered its balance and lurched towards Shepperton. I knew now for certain that these giants were indeed machines, and that a Martian sat in the hood of each, directing and controlling it. The living intelligence, the Martian within the hood of the machine before us, was slain and splashed to the 4 winds of heaven, and the thing was now but a mere intricate device of metal whirling to destruction. It drove along in a straight line, incapable of guidance. It struck the tower of Shepperton Church, smashing it down as the impact of a battering ram might have done, swerved aside, blundered on, and collapsed with a tremendous impact into the river, out of my sight. A violent explosion shook the air, and a spout of water, steam, mud, and shattered metal shot far up into the sky. As the generator of the heat ray hit the water, it flashed into steam, and in another moment a huge wave, like a muddy tidal bore, but almost scaldingly hot, came sweeping round the bend upstream. I saw people struggling shorewards and heard their screaming and shouting faintly above the seething and roar of the Martian's collapse. I splashed through the tumultuous water until I could see round the bend. 6 deserted boats pitched aimlessly upon the confusion of the waves. The fallen Martian lay across the river downstream, for the most part submerged. Thick clouds of steam were pouring off the wreckage, and the gigantic limbs churned the water and flung a thick spray of mud and froth into the air. The tentacles swayed and struck like living arms, and save for the helpless purposelessness of these movements, it was as if some wounded thing struggled for life amidst the waves. Enormous quantities of a ruddy brown fluid were spurting up in noisy jets out of the machine. My attention was diverted by a furious yelling, and I saw a man knee-deep near the towpath shouting and pointing. Looking back, I saw the other Martians advancing with gigantic strides down the river bank from the direction of Chertsey. The Shepperton guns spoke this time unavailingly. At that I ducked under the water and, holding my breath, blundered painfully along under the surface as long as I could. The water was in a tumult about me and rapidly growing hotter. I raised my head to take breath and saw the Martians. They had passed me by, and 2 were stooping over the frothing, tumultuous ruins of their comrade. The 3rd and 4th stood beside him in the water, one perhaps 200 yards from me, the other over towards Laleham. The generators of the heat rays waved high, and the hissing beams smote down this way and that. The air was full of sound, a deafening and confusing conflict of noises. The clangorous din of the Martians, the crash of falling houses, the thud of trees, fences, sheds flashing into flame, and the crackling and roaring of fire. Dense black smoke was leaping up to mingle with the steam from the river, and as the heat rays went to and fro over Weybridge, their impact was marked by flashes of incandescent white that gave place at once to a smoky dance of lurid flames. For a moment, perhaps, I stood there, breast high in the almost boiling water, dumbfounded at my position, hopeless of escape. Then suddenly the white flashes of the heat ray came leaping towards me. The houses caved in as they dissolved at its touch and darted out flames. The trees changed to fire with a roar. It flickered up and down the towing path, licking off the people who ran this way and that, and came down to the water's edge, not 50 yards from where I stood. It swept across the river to Shepperton, and the water in its track rose in a boiling wheel, crested with steam. In another moment the huge wave, well nigh at the boiling point, had rushed upon me. I screamed aloud, and scalded, half-blinded, agonized, I staggered through the leaping, hissing water towards the shore. I fell helplessly in full sight of the Martians upon the broad, bare, gravelly spit that runs down to mark the angle of the Wey and the Thames. I expected nothing but death. I have a dim memory of the foot of a Martian coming down within a score of yards of my head, driving straight into the loose gravel, whirling it this way and that, and lifting again, of a long moment of suspense, and then of the four carrying the debris of their comrade between them, now clear and then presently faint, through a veil of smoke, receding interminably, as it seemed to me, across a vast space of river and meadow. And then, very slowly, I realized that by a miracle I had escaped. After giving this sudden lesson in the power of terrestrial weapons, the Martians retreated to their original position upon Horsell Common, and in their haste, and encumbered with the debris of their smashed companion, they overlooked many a stray and unnecessary victim, such as myself. Had they left their comrade and pushed on forthwith, there was nothing at that time between them and London but batteries of 12-pounder guns, and they would certainly have reached the capital in advance of the tidings of their approach. But they were in no hurry. From Mars, cylinder followed cylinder in its interplanetary flight. Every 24 hours brought them reinforcements. And meanwhile, the military and naval authorities, now fully alive to the tremendous power of their antagonists, worked with furious energy. Every minute a fresh gun came into position, until, before twilight, every copse, every row of suburban villas on the hilly slopes about Kingston and Richmond masked an expectant black muzzle. And through the charred and desolated area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. But the Martians now understood our command of artillery and the danger of human proximity, and not a man ventured within a mile of either cylinder, save at the price of his life. The Martians spent the earlier part of the afternoon in transferring everything from the second and third cylinders at Addlestone and Purford to their original pit on Horsell Common. Over that, above the blackened heather and ruined buildings that stretched far and wide, stood one as sentinel, while the rest abandoned their vast fighting machines and descended into the pit. They were hard at work there far into the night, and the towering pillar of dense green smoke that rose therefrom could be seen from the hills about Merrow, and even, it is said, from Banstead and Epsom Downs. And while the Martians behind me were thus preparing for their next sally, I made my way from the fire and smoke of burning Weybridge towards London. It is a curious thing that I felt angry with my wife. I cannot account for it, but my impotent desire to reach Leatherhead worried me excessively. After some time I saw an abandoned boat drifting downstream, and throwing off most of my sodden clothes, I went after it. There were no oars in the boat, but I contrived to paddle, as much as my parboiled hands would allow, down the river towards Walton and Halliford, going very tediously, and continuously looking behind me, as you may well understand. I followed the river because I considered the water gave me my best chance of escape, should the Martians return. For a long time I drifted and paddled, and at last, as the bridge at Walton was coming into sight round the bend, my fever and faintness overcame my fears, and I landed on the Middlesex bank and lay down, deadly sick, amidst the long grass.